All right, good afternoon. Week 7, continuing the discussions on the third and final phase of this class, which is essentially about what can we do with the findings, right? So the first third was focused on finding a topic, developing it, refining it into a research question, generating or taking very specific positions and stance in response to those questions. And most importantly, through these tools of questions, positions, hypotheses, assumptions, we went through the process of connecting to larger questions and issues, which we call discourses, right? So we talked about different tools and different ways to situate our work and relate our work to larger domains, some within and closely related to architecture, some pushing the architectural envelope or even going beyond. The second third of the class was about, now that we had a position and we had some hypotheses and assumptions, we wanted to test it, or we wanted to test them, right? So that's where the methodological framework, strategies, very specific tactics and tools came in. And through different examples, we learned about historic interpretive methodology, qualitative research methodology, correlational research methodology, more traditional architectural research through precedent studies, through making, crafting, performance evaluations. So we gave you a glimpse of different tactics we can use to test out, depending on how we are framing our topic and questions, how we can test them. And then from last week, after assignment 2, we started to talk about the motivations behind the research, and those are connected to what can we do with our findings. So what? We have now tested our hypothesis and we have either confirmed it, or we have nullified it, or we understand that based on the findings, our initial assumptions need to be modified and refined. So the big question now is, so what? Why does it matter? For whom does it matter? So we talked about purpose and audience last week. So today's or this week's discussion is very much about the impact of our research outcomes, right? And it's an important part of any research, but more importantly in architecture, whether we are doing a pure research or we are doing a design-based application, that oftentimes, which is embedded in our practice and profession, is we have to communicate our findings with our audience, right? And sometimes it's a final critique in class studios. Sometimes it's a public presentation. Sometimes it's an internal presentation in your employers. So it really becomes a way to visually, orally, and in many cases through written format, communicating not just reporting of the findings, but essentially what does it mean? What is the imperative? Why we should pay attention to these inferences? So there are a bunch of things we do at this time. So one, we draw conclusions, we generalize it, right? We talk about next steps of research based on those conclusions, that certain things we need to do further. We discuss strengths and limitations of the project, where we say that we really focused on these things, and these 2 or 3 aspects we are able to, and that's the strength of the project, where we are able to really gain information about. But we can also talk about missing links and gaps for which we need to further look into it. The other thing we can do is, as we are generalizing, we are drawing conclusions, we often need to connect back to the initial questions of discourses, right? And this is where the research project comes full circle, that oftentimes when we talk about why certain things are important, we need to connect back to those larger questions, larger issues that we started to talk about in at the initial phases. But so this week we are focusing on predominantly dissemination, communication, and how, in what different ways, research and design outcomes can be talked about, right? And if you have gone through the readings or you're doing the readings, um, there the specifically if you look at, there was a quite kind of a fictional reading about the futuristic aerial theater through airplanes and the moves and personalization of the air sound and things like that. It's a very visual description of a very specific kind of performance. So there is a visualization element of the outcome, which is essentially riding the flights and doing tricks with it. But through the visualization, the author is trying to give us information about the risks and the danger and the thrill and the exhilaration and the experience about it. And so those are the important outcomes for the author. Or if we look at the reading like the Terry Smith's reading on Making the Modern, where he's looking into specifically into Ford and Fordism, there's a very valuable lesson that a lot of the outcomes that we commonly attribute to Ford and Fordist way of thinking, like the assembly line, like automation, like division of labor and completely mechanizing it, it's not that he invented them, right? So, I mean, that goes back to some of our discussion earlier that any good design or research outcome doesn't have to be always based on or novelty, or in other words, it doesn't have to be always something new. What he did was not invention or creation, but he did was very innovative coupling or very innovative packaging. So the idea of automation, the idea of division of labor, idea of structuring an assembly line based on its component parts and component elements and processes, that whole idea was already there in United States, in other parts, not in Detroit automotive industry. It was there in certain industrial small scale processes in Europe, but he was innovative and smart in borrowing and bringing those ideas and packaging them for a different industry. So what his innovation and creation was about essentially was in application. Good research, good packaging, and great application. So this reading really goes through how some of these got reflected into Albert Kahn's architecture and the spaces, and then gets into a critical reflection of modes of production, consumption, and an overall critique of the capitalist structure or structural framework and capitalist economy in general, to talk about Fordism. If you look at readings like Corbusier and Brazil, his planning in Rio de Janeiro, and his planning work in Algiers, which were influenced by his work in Rio de Janeiro, they talk about, or the author is talking about Morshed, Adnan Morshed. He's talking about the planning outcomes as a product of a very specific way of looking at the city, and that is the aerial view, which completely changes the viewpoint and way of thinking, which was based on aviation technology, transatlantic flights. So the important thing to pay attention to here is that there are a lot of internal and external processes and forces, technological developments, social cultural elements that influence our design outcome. And it's important to recognize those. It's important to identify those and actually work with those. Oftentimes we talk to students like all of you about this exact thing when we talk about your portfolios. And we ask you to look at not just one work, but a body of work and identify certain things or patterns that's repeating, or if you see certain motivations or certain influences you have from the very beginning till the more recent works, it's important to identify them and highlight or represent them in specific ways in your work, in your portfolio. So the portfolio is a body of outcomes where you're visually communicating the outcomes, but the outcome connects to the methodology and the discourses. So we will be talking about building a kind of narrative, a kind of storyline through your projects. Whether it's in case of portfolio, it's a body of design work. In this class, we are going to talk about your case study analysis and the possible development of a project through materials of assignment 1, through materials of assignment 2, and then next week you will be working on assignment 3. And all those 3 things would come together to create that narrative, which will be the focus of the assignment of the research video, the assignment 4. Okay. Same thing with the virtual Tate. This reading, they look into different scenarios and how considering certain scenarios influence almost in a parametric way changes and transforms the outcomes, and why this kind of scenario playing. And if you remember some readings, specifically the if-then reading, the Sherman reading from last week, it was all about conjecture and constructing scenarios and how we can use that as a design strategy. And finally, the Willis reading, which looks into kind of interesting reading on architectural documentation and thinking about architectural documentation beyond just textbooks and archival books, and how we can think about drawing, diagramming, products, sculptures, models, and new ways of documenting, whether it's through photograph, whether it's through curation, whether it's through exhibition, how we can document these kind of processes and products, not to look at them as products, but also how that can help us think and design in new ways. So I'm, in a way, I gave you kind of summary of all the readings and the role each reading has, and we would go around and see what worked for you, or are there questions and concerns based on this idea of research outcome and its importance. So I would like to do 2 things today. One, talk about this week's reading, and specifically through 2 questions. One, can you use some of the things that you are seeing in these readings and connect to the case study analysis and the case studies that you have done, and the kind of outcomes you are seeing in those projects? And the second thing I would like to ask you is, when we think about research or design outcomes, can you talk about either a possible outcome for a project that you're thinking in this class, or a design studio, or any other project in the past that you have done? And can you talk about one specific outcome and how you see that outcome as a product of certain influences, or what were some of the key decision makers or critical elements behind those outcomes? I mean, it could be one drawing, it could be one model, it could be a set of drawings, it could be one diagram. That's to you, which outcome you want to select. But so those are the 2 things related to this week's material I would like to talk. The other thing that I want to mention is there will not be a Thursday class next week, considering the July 4th weekend and the Independence Day in the United States. So I would briefly like to talk about assignment 3 and go over it so that we can proactively or kind of do a preemptive strike on that, because we won't have time to talk about next week. Okay. So I would like to open up, and I want you guys to jump in. Let's first tackle any question about this week's reading, any specific reading, and keep in mind those two structural questions. One, do you see any specific way we can talk about case study analysis that you have been looking at, case studies, and how you see some of the outcomes are being generated there? And secondly, any research or design outcome in your experience for your work, and can you talk about that outcome in relation to influences, motivations, specific audiences, specific decision-making process? Okay. Who wants to jump in?
I guess I could start.
Go ahead, Josh.
But I guess the first question is about using any of the readings, and I haven't made it all the way through the Corbu one yet. I was kind of skimming through it. And I think one of the things that interested me most was this distance point of view he had, because he was in the airplane. He wasn't down on the ground, kind of in the thick of the city. And thinking about my case study and being kind of a younger, able-bodied person, kind of being very distanced from the type of life experience that somebody or my audience would have from my research, and how that might be biasing my point of view or anything I could be developing at the moment. And it was just, I think, this comparison of distance from the actual experience. So I was kind of curious maybe to read through that more. And then as far as the second question about a research outcome or an outcome from some influence, I had a residential project where the homeowner wanted to add a covered porch to his home, but as we got into researching local zoning things, that wasn't going to be permitted due to setbacks, and that ended up influencing another solution to create a covered projection that was attached to the house that wouldn't be considered, as part of the lot area coverage. So there's kind of a unique architectural detail that ended up resulting from that.
Okay. Yeah, so I think let me kind of respond to your first comment on the Corbusier reading. I think, Corbusier talks about a lot about a moment or his one experience that in some ways a transformative experience for him personally, that influenced his thinking. In case of Rio, which influenced Rio's planning, but also Algiers, was that view from the top. In case of Chandigarh, for example, in India where he worked, it was more of a, not a top-down view, but more of a more embedded, empathetic view of the rural landscape, the cows with the long horns, like the Texas Longhorns, and which influenced not just symbolism and some of his artistic influences in the large secretariat project as he was designing a new capital for the state of Punjab, but also it transformed how he used concrete and what he wanted to do with the concrete. So I think the key parameter or the key lesson for others as we look at works by architects like Corbusier is how we can identify that moment that in some way is empowering and transformative for us, but then take it further, make it not just a crowbar and just a moment, but continue that very systematically throughout the project, right? And that's where it becomes from just a knee-jerk experience or a singular moment to a more methodological research-based design thinking. I mean, sometimes it happens consciously, sometimes it is subconsciously or unconsciously. And some of these kind of projects, or like I was talking about, portfolios, are those analytical moments where we can kind of consciously recognize some of those unconscious moves. The other point to that is the idea of the flight and the different viewpoints. Sometimes it's top down, sometimes it's actually more embedded experience. It actually has influenced artists and designers and architects for a long time. Um, so, for example, even Dr. Feng's research in the Chinese village is influenced in a lot by kind of an embedded, empathetic observation, being part of that community. Um, Rem Koolhaas talks a lot about Hong Kong and his experience of Hong Kong, especially when flying in and out, right? Vis-a-vis a kind of street experience of Hong Kong, which is very different than looking in from the top. And specifically, he talks about the whole slum city of Kowloon, which is actually demolished now. But according to him, it gave him a perspective of density and section that he not only used in his projects in Hong Kong, but many theoretical and practical projects, competitions, designs across the globe. So again, the idea of one moment and then taking that and making it a strategy, right? The, not the direct outcome, but the lessons and the critical aspect of that learning in other projects. So that's something to learn with. Um, and I think this different point of view has been part of knowledge building overall as a human knowledge, right? When in medieval times, everything was kind of a homocentric or individual centric, like we considered individual man or individual woman. Like I would consider I am the center of the world, right? Everything revolves around me, and then Earth is the center of the universe, and sun rotates around the Earth. And with Renaissance, with scientific knowledge, with mathematical knowledge, people like Galileo and Copernicus, it changed our worldview. We came to know that sun is the center of the solar system. Later, we found out that sun itself is not the center of the universe. When it's an ever-expanding universe, and so on and so forth. So as we changed our point of view of the world, it actually changed our capacity to even look at a smaller project. And even small techniques like perspectives, how that allowed us to think about architectural projects, urban planning projects, urban design projects in different way. I mean, before perspective was developed during Renaissance times, all drawings were done almost like a series of elevations. I mean, even if you look at older miniature paintings and picturesque drawings, I mean, you will see that there is no sense of depth. When everything is kind of looks as layers one on top of each other. There is no perception of depth of fields or vanishing lines, those kind of things. So the perspectives, 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, multiple points, allowed us to actually free ourselves from the element that we are designing. So we could free ourselves as a viewer and then the world we are designing. And that, for a long time, influenced that whole kind of hand of God, hand of designer attitude. That so Michelangelo, when he was designing Piazza del Popolo in Rome, when he could say that I want to create a new order, that this is building A and this is building B, and right now it's not symmetrical, and I want to create that symmetry. Before the advent of perspective, that vision, that visualization was not there. So whether it's a mathematical idea like perspectives, and its visual manifestation, whether it's a technology like flights and airplanes, whether it's other tools like survey levels that give us ideas of topography and landscape. They influence how we design and then ultimately the outcomes and what we come up with. So that's something that was the point of the reading and some of the things I wanted to highlight. Second point about the project and the setbacks and the zoning and these as influences, these are good actually also segue, and I'm going to bring some of these today in the discussion, looking forward to the assignment 3, which is all about context of our project and context of our design outcomes. So when we produce something, whether it's a building, an interior project, a city, a small neighborhood plan, whatever that is, a product, that is always framed by certain context. And when I say context, it's not just the site. I mean, those are common context that we put a project in a site. So the physical site, the boundary conditions, shape of the site, what is there on the site is obviously a physical context. But it could be, like you said, a zoning, right? That dictates certain setbacks and open space requirements, etc. That provides a legal context because zoning is a legal document. And that may point to certain aspirations that are promoted through incentives or certain prohibitions that are kind of laid out through regulations. And zoning is about those two things, which talks about what that city culturally and socially, politically want to achieve and what they don't want to do. So that's puts a broader political, social, cultural context. There could be a context of money, right? Whole financial context of your client, which influenced your outcome or which encouraged or forced you in innovating certain solution, right? You had to rethink 10 different ways of accommodating that budget, right? Like that program could easily become a context to which your design responds to. And it could be literally a program handed out. Kulhas and Bernard Shumi, they talk about program in a larger sense as well. And next week you will have some of these readings where when programs doesn't have to be always the space program of, okay, bedroom, this many square foot, or dining room, this many square foot, or it doesn't have to be toilets and reception area. I mean, programming could be about a certain experience of sun. Programming could be events. Programming could be experiences. So next week assignment will force you and encourage you to think about context in a broad way. And I would ask you to look at 3 elements in the case study and then in your project that you are developing. One of which, in each case, in the case study as well as in your project, one of the elements must be program. But you're going to tell us how in the case study the designer or the architect or the firm defined program, how they use that to respond through their design outcomes. And similarly, what were 2 other important contextual elements, whether it's cost, whether it's site, how is it defined? Is it just one site, physical site? Is it the environment? Is it a cost based on materials and what's available? Is it a cost based on what client gave? So you have to identify 3 elements. One I'm giving you, requiring you to look at program, and the other 2 you can select. But in each case, you have to see how it is defined in the precedent study. And then for your project, you can use the same element program and the same two other elements, those same three elements that you were using in the case study now for your project. But this time for your project, you have to tell, how do you define it? How do you define program? How do you define site? How do you define cost? Right? I'm just giving cost and site as two examples. You don't have to do cost and site. I mean, you can do something else. So the project will be, the assignment will be about that. Okay. Okay, let's move on to somebody else. Any other question, comment, personal influence on a design outcome, anything to do with readings?
I thought that in the writing about Corbusier with the airplanes, it was rather interesting to me that the airplanes could have such a significant effect on his architecture while them not actually being architectural in any real sense. Airplanes are very separate technology from architecture, but can still affect it. And that kind of helps me get in the mindset of looking at other things that are not just architecture that might influence my ideas about architecture.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you look closely to many things, I mean, we can identify those connections that lot of non-formal, typically in architecture, we focus on formal elements, right? Shape, form, aesthetics, proportion, ratio, materials, construction of, even when we're looking at processes of crafting, making, fabrication, technology, we are focused on, okay, what kind of architectural forms it creates. So oftentimes we will find that non-formal elements, which we define as forces, influence in very significant way. I mean, even, I mean, common examples are environmental forces like light, gravity, of course, wind, things like that. Building regulations, we just talked about, zoning. I mean, these are external forces, legal regulations, and they influence very specifically form of buildings, form of skyscrapers. If you look at Manhattan or Chicago downtown or many other places. Suburban single family home and its built form, and we have talked about that. I mean, that's a result of a lot of architectural technology like balloon framing, certain ways of construction, but in many ways it's influenced by a lot of things which are remote to architecture, right? So the whole highway and freeway construction through national defense funding, that came about because they wanted to, the original idea was to disperse nuclear warheads, not to keep them in one or two centrally located areas, and really disperse it throughout the country, so that in case of war or a big attack, which was the concern after World War II, that the sense of safety and security, or a sense of fear even, right? I mean, these are socio-political concerns, not really architectural formal issues, or even the social cultural pressure in some way supported by government policies, financial regulations, taxation policies, bank mortgage policies, as well as popular culture and media about gender roles, value of family, and we talked about that in one of previous weeks. These are not architectural at all, but has influenced the design, siting, location, landscape, front lawn, backyard, picket fences, right? The whole, I mean, some of you are working on the notion of American dream. It has nothing to do with core architecture. So I think, I mean, this is a good to have cultural, socio-political awareness for any project you do, however, whatever the scale is, small or large, to, even if it's not directly influencing, to think about how these kind of elements influence and impact your outcome. And essentially, these are a similar discussion about discourses. And that's where we are kind of wrapping up as we are moving toward the end of the semester. Okay, anybody else after two Joshes?
I can go if you can hear me.
Yes. Yes, Trevor.
So I was the Nairobi air experiment, or the one about air quality in Nairobi. I thought it had a lot of direct similarities in my assignment too. When I was looking at green building and then its pertinence to I guess how it affects or like can better affect low income thing in Detroit. And so I saw the issues that the MIT study was touching on with the air quality in Nairobi is very similar, because they as a major limitation. And so the outcome that I'm understanding from they have like this low cost it's like some type of instrument, the air quality, and I've been looking at the data for that, and right now is how I can more closely what I've been looking at in Detroit, because I would say things are not obviously to that point or that extreme yet, but I like the bottleneck of trying to integrate the technology that everybody kind of perceives as too expensive for a certain area or a certain income, how to go away. And they deal with air quality, and in Detroit, it's more affordable and sustainable. I think that there's enough similarity between comparison.
Yeah, I think brought in the example of the MIT, the Sensible City projects. Yeah, I forgot to mention that as I was summarizing in the intro, the readings. I mean, that's a great resource. And I think in the last several years after I introduced that, I mean, most of my students have said that it was one of the useful reference in this class, because you directly see, I mean, such a profound, invigorating, interesting, and provocative application of projects which are simulation based. I mean, their focus is on handheld devices and certain ways of data collection and use, but a lot of projects, especially in urban scale globally, are happening in that realm. I mean, a couple of things to learn from there is, one, there is kind of two halves of that project, or many of the similar projects like Sensible City projects at MITs and others. One is identifying the problem and collecting data about it. So that, is it a problem of air pollution? What is it? How much? Where is it happening? What are the sources? And how we can find the data about that. So that's one. And second is, what can we do about it? How we can mitigate that? How we can stop that or reduce that? Now, these point to certain strategies and tactics that oftentimes, and that's where I think it's interesting that you're thinking about your project in Detroit and certain way of application. Maybe you have to modify certain things. And so the key is to understand those strategies of collection as well as mitigation, and sometimes decontextualize it. So forget about Nairobi, just look at the strategy and see how we can use the strategy and deploy in Detroit, or deploy in Seoul, or deploy in Beijing, right? And that's essentially what Ford did. and that's the connection with the Ford reading, is that he borrowed, or in a good way I'm saying this, copied, right, found that technology and applied it in a very appropriate, or even beyond appropriate, in a smart way. And that was the design. Design was not to come up with the idea of assembly line, but how to apply it, how to deploy it. So, I mean, Nairobi, how, because of the context, cost played an important factor because of their economy and their population and the social cultural context. I mean, obviously, a high cost solution won't work. If the same problem, I mean, happens, I mean, it happens in developed nations and developed economies, it has been attempted to be addressed in many different ways, which probably are more cost intensive. But I mean, Detroit presents an important case because as a city, I mean, it was bankrupt, and there is this economic and social cultural stress, though parts of it is coming back. There's this foreclosure problems. There's this green infrastructure of vacant land. So you may deploy some of those things, but you may also, because of, again, I'm bringing the third assignment idea of the context, you may be able to use something else as an asset as part of your tool or strategy to improve the air quality, right? Whether it could be framed based on the sources of air pollution, whether it's the industries or the roadways. It could be based on certain assets like vacant land, and can we do forestation, and does that improve air quality, or do we need to do something else? So how you collect the information and how you kind of borrow some of these tactics using some of your case studies and then deploy or apply it become an interesting process of research and design.
So clarify too, to make sure in this next, our task is to basically take what we're understanding from the case studies and how they achieve that outcome, and then applying it to and
Yeah,
how
it's the same mechanism. So you use the same case study you have used in assignment 1, assignment 2. Assignment 1, the focus was on discourses. Assignment 2, the focus was on methods. Assignment 3, the focus is on outcomes and their context.
Okay.
And
so can I
select
create a new
specific contextual element? One of these elements has to be programmed, and the other two you can identify based on your analysis. And you have to define, describe, and explain how those three elements, one being program, was used as a context by the designer in that project.
Okay.
And based on that learning, let me finish, sorry. Based on that learning, you then apply that to your possible project development. That for my project, you are saying that this could be a possible outcome. And this, most importantly, would be influenced by context element 1, context element 2, context element 3. Again, one of those three elements has to be programmed.
Okay.
The other two could be the same as what you selected for the case study, could be different.
Okay. So then, as for the reading exercises and how that can tie into next phase, would those kind of be documentation or supporting references?
Yes.
Like how? Okay. So kind of similar again.
Right. So the next week's reading, let me look at it as we're talking about. Let me share my screen. Maybe it's a good time to, we'll go a little bit back and forth to talk about the research assignment 3. Can you all see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the assignment we talked about, kind of defines the overall premise of the context and how, irrespective of the type of project, there is always a context. There is always cultural and social context, technological context, very specific architectural context, site, program, and others. And there is no right or wrong answer. And then I've given you certain steps which I just talked about, which you have to do for your case study, and then repeat that for your own project. Similar outcomes. By Wednesday of next week, I would like to see 6, 8.5 by 11 slides, up to 6, and then by the following Sunday, I do expect between 9 and 12, so up to 12 slides. Okay, same process. And after Wednesday, I would give you a quick feedback. You should submit it in the assignment as well as in your discussion forum. The forum is for you to give each other, one another feedback. And then the submitting through the assignment, submitting as an attachment in the assignment is for me to quickly review and give you feedback. Okay. Now, going back to that week's module, which would be week 8, forum 3. So you will have all the readings. There are 2 required readings. So the first reading, the Koolhaas Shumi, it's a very interesting reading about comparison of Rem Koolhaas and Bernard Shumi. It's actually an interview with each of them. And they talk about or respond to 10 questions, the same questions, and the questions are on program. So how do they define and interpret program in their projects, right? And I wanted to give that reading because program is a required element for each of you to look at your case study and then for your project for the assignment. And then Eisenstadt reading is a great reading because it really frames the overall discussion about context. And he argues that a project or architectural projects don't have a single context. And we, 2 of us, can look at the same project. For me, the context could be very different than what you say is the important context. And it's not that you are wrong and I'm right or vice versa. It's that we see the project in different ways. And similarly, the key is when a designer looks at a project, when somebody is designing a project, what becomes most important for him or her? And if you notice, that question is essential in each and every step of this class or what we are learning in this class. In each and every step of research, each and every step of design. In discourses, we asked you which position, which discourses, which topics, which disciplines, which issues you think for you are the most important, right? In case study analysis, as do for the designer directly or through interpretation, what do you think for the designer was the important topic? For your project, what you think is the most important? Same with the methods. If that's the important issues and positions, what would be the important tools to measure it, evaluate it, test it? Now we are asking you if through that process we can generate specific outcome. How can we talk about that outcome through the lens of very specific context that influences that outcome, right? And there could be 100 contexts, but the point is what you think is the most important or are the most important influences or the contextual elements. So the readings are very specifically given for you to see master designers like Shumi and Koolhaas, how they use an contextual element like program Do they define it in the same way? Do they interpret it in the same way? How does their interpretation influence their design process and then design outcome? Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Next, who else? Any other question? Question, comment, thoughts? Come on, I need at least a couple of other voices.
I can go.
Yes, Austin, go ahead.
So,
Or,
hello?
yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, Anthony, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
So in the futurist aerial theory reading, I was kind of wondering how that could relate to research methods in this class. And I think you mentioned it earlier. It's how you experience something that's being read or presented, and what the reader can get from the I guess the writer in this situation. And I can see how that can relate to my case study, Terraform One, and some of their end products. It's about how the user can experience it, or how what we can get from their project. A lot of their stuff is very futuristic and kind of a bit of a shock value with their cricket shelter project. It's kind of something that's out there, and it makes you kind of think about it. So yeah, I guess taking away from that reading is just something that just getting sorry, kind of lost my train of thought there. The just getting something from the presenter is, I guess, the most important part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a good observation. I think, I mean, two things. And personally, for me, from that reading, that really takeaway come across as an important takeaway. One is what you talked about. Okay, what can we learn about as a student of research methods? I think, I mean, that reading was not much about application of a research method, but the method is based on the profession and the technology, the flights. In that case, for the performance, the method is in a way given, right? The method or the strategy is what can we do with the flight and perform the tricks, and the strategy would be to select different flights who can do different things based on the strategies, or based on what we want, what kind of tricks we want to do. And so there is, of course, some form of strategic thinking in terms of tool selection, or in this case, which flight to select. So I think that's one. I think the whole reading spoke to me. One is how we can communicate, talk about, write about, and possibly in our discipline, visually communicate and show very personal experiences as we are going through the process. So the author very eloquently talks about personal experience of flying and doing these performances and tricks. Whether it's about experiencing and feeling the sound of the flights and giving certain almost character and personalization, whether it's about a sense of heroism and identifying. And in a way, you are right that it is about, to some extent, sensationalizing it, and it's a marketing pitch, about the validity of the work, and putting it out there and promoting it. And that's an important part of our discipline as well, that how we can communicate that why this work is important. I mean, that doesn't mean that it's about making up everything and it's all bells and whistles and there is no substance, but it is based on how we can talk about and communicate the importance of what we are doing. So in terms of the content, I mean, it's highly unrelated. I mean, flying a one-seater or a two-seater, a two-engine flight doing tricks versus designing a project, an architectural project. But in terms of talking about the outcomes, presenting it in front of clients and your audience, and that's where the audience come in. Do they know about flights? So in this case, pay attention. How does the author talk about different technical aspects of flights and its details to an audience, to his readers who are not probably just aviators and pilots and flight enthusiasts, right? So those are the things I think we can learn and take away from the reading. I mean, of course, the reading is interesting in terms of the content, but what strategies we can take to talk about our project depending on the audience, how we can talk about it, what information to give, what not to give. Do we use a lot of jargons or not? How should we can extend that to how should we draw and diagram and showcase things. So I think that's an important and that's an interesting read, and kind of looking at outside a discipline, complete little bit of a kind of eccentric reading in terms of the performance and the real flights. Any follow-up, Anthony?
No, I don't think so.
Anybody else?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So following up from that reading, some of the things that I took away was how the author was talking about how each flyer has a different state of mind as well.
Mm-hmm.
And how each one expresses them with the loops, with the dives, and all the hoops, and like each one has a different emotion. Which one gives off anger or fatigue, and as well as what you were talking about earlier. So it was a connection of how each one has a different state of mind and how they fly, how we view things, and how we see each design. Like we don't all see the same thing, like as well as the context. Each one has different context. So that's one thing that I kind of took away from the reading, and how as well as like the flying theater is free to everybody. The sky is their stage, and how one thing I can take away is our design is free to everybody. It's not limited to nobody. So those are some of the few things I kind of took away from the reading.
Yeah, I think I mean, there is an interesting parallel, what you were talking about, of that flying experience to some extent design experience. I mean, again, not in terms of the content, but as a process. And I mean, Azari talks about that in his reading, that the flying and the outcome of that performance is very much about what you just said, the state of mind of the aviator or the state of mind of the pilot. And the state of mind, what he or she is seeing, how the experience and the feeling is, results in very specific decisions she or he is making during the process, right? Which angle to take, what speed to go, even when you're doing the dives, loops, and other things, where to start and where to end, should be the sequence, right? I mean, all these can have several permutation and combination. I mean, though you have the same method or the same plane or the same technology, depending on the pilot, depending on the aviator, the performance will be very different. And similar to our design projects in studios, for example, you have 16 students, same project, same site, same requirement. We have 16 different outcomes because individually how you read into, interpret, analyze the project and its elements, how you read its context, how you bring your background and other experiences inside and outside the school into the project. What, like Corbusier, what you suddenly see and how you connect that to the project. So, I mean, I think it talks about a very individual, personal experience of flying or design in terms of connecting with the context and the decision making. However, though the experience is very individual and personal, the process as a whole goes through some of the similar or same structure and steps and methods.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anybody? Austin, Catherine, Mylene, Simon, Stefan?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Austin.
So relating to my project that I was looking at, the Corbusier reading of the perspective from the airplane to design the city.
Yeah.
What I was looking at for the case studies was how the typologies are formed within communities. And a lot of times, especially in the residential aspect of architecture, what's viewed is from the streetscape. So if that's viewed from, like, I don't know, a different perspective, then that can change your whole outlook on how neighborhoods should be designed and things like that.
Yeah, I think what's key is that which decisions to make based on these specific viewpoints, right? And to recognize and acknowledge its impact on the outcome. So whether we make certain design moves or decisions based on a plan view or a neighborhood view, and then understand its implications. So I may do a building like a donut, and if that the only reason is that, oh, that looks cool from if I'm flying over it, I mean, that's great, but is it relevant and important enough, right? There might be other reasons behind that donut and how it connects with a certain typology of buildings in the context, and the donut allows for evaporative cooling in the environment. So it's I mean, what you said is very important about oftentimes in design projects, different views lead us to certain decision making. But I think at the same time, we have to acknowledge that, I mean, something we can say that, oh, this decision was a predominantly an aesthetic choice, and we wanted it to look interesting and cool from the top. Great. But that may not be the only influence or just the only thing about that project. It needs to go beyond. Or a certain decision that we make from a plan view or a top-down view might have very sincere and critical implication in the street, on the street, in terms of vista or scale and sense of enclosure or other things. And then we have to connect that decision and that view or the shape or the angle that we can see from the top has this specific implication or influence on the street view. So oftentimes it's about, and that's why we have these tools at our disposition, and that's why we want you to draw plans and sections and from different sides and elevations and do models and do different perspectives, not just to give you requirements to do and fill up pages or sheets, but different viewpoints are also learning tools for you, the designer, to understand the project and the implications of your design decisions. So we can see that, oh, the thing that we did in plan looks in this way, and that might be a problem in section or elevation. And that's why it's an iterative process and going back and forth between plan and section, or plan and elevation and section, or between 2D drawings like that and models, between digital model and physical model, and so on and so forth. A lot of these things happen quickly. A lot of these things happen simultaneously. A lot of these things happen between different points of view. Any other question, comment?
Actually, this is more of a comment. This is actually what you just said kind of brings up when I was looking into Williamson and Wellington in the beginning, there was a project that kind of just that wasn't directly related to my precedent study, but it was just showed up how they took a top-down approach to the typology of a neighborhood and kind of diagrammed it in such a way that it identified, or it gave precedence to their study and how they were going to formulate the building based off of what is actually in the area and how all the components kind of get put together. So it kind of gives you a better perspective on how changing the point of view will kind of identify a project a little bit more and kind of give you, I guess, more meat on the bones, like as per se.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I mean, the whole purpose of design, or in terms of the design methodology, is consciously identifying sources of information that we can say influenced our design decision, right? And that's the whole process that we want you to go through, we critique you on. And as you have evolved throughout the years in studios and other classes, we want you to go beyond just personal preferences as information sources, personal likings, and to use other things in the context, right? Whether it's a physical site or a landscape, environment, sun, wind, programs given to you by the client, cost, and different studios do it in a different way, given the focus and the constraint of that studio. So I mean, the typology and the neighborhood typology, again, is an important source to understand the context. Typology, we have discussed earlier, is an interesting tool because it accepts the form. It doesn't get into dissecting and analyzing the social cultural forces behind it, because it assumes that it's a typology, let's say a courtyard typology, because it has a historic social cultural precedent and forces behind it. Some could be because of the environment and climate. Some could be based on the social use of spaces between inside and outside, or other things. But it accepts the typology and then either reinvents, refines, completely accepts and reinforces, or contradicts through maybe some other information sources that's needed to be addressed for the design. Okay. Again, anybody can jump in with some of these questions, but also I would like to little bit shift. I already, to answer, I think, Trevor's question, went to the assignment 3 and talked about that. But I want to open up to all of you to ask question about assignment 3, if something you want me to clarify further. Yeah, feel free to ask. Okay, so if there is no question at this time, so I mean, do this week's materials, but also maybe skim through, read through the assignment 3, and specifically the overall premise, the specific steps related to context, 3 elements that you need to identify within the context. One has to be a program, so that is given. So when you do the case study analysis, it has to be program, and then context element 2, context element 3. And then for your project, it has to be program as a context, and then context element 2, context element 3, using which you will present how these contextual elements influence and are critical for your research/design outcome and proposition. Okay, and you will document that as a draft by Wednesday, up to 6 pages, and then up to 12 pages final assignment 3 by next Sunday.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Mylene.
When you say program, are you talking about the program relating to the case study that what influenced their decisions? Oh, the method I want to make sure.
Yeah, so when I say program, what I want you to look at when you're doing the case study analysis, like if I remember, you were looking at NADA, right? Yeah. So you have to see that does program or how program influences that specific project of NADA. Do they talk about program? If so, how do they define program? And then the second step will be for your project, how can program be defined and how can program influence your design proposition?
Okay.
Okay, so this is more not, I mean, you can talk about the program in relation to methodology, but the focus is more on program and its influence on the final outcome.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yep, thanks. Anybody else? Any question? All right, in that case, we'll wrap it up today. If you have any question in the meantime, and if there are more questions that arise based on your reading about this week's material or assignment 3 and the 4 on context next week, feel free to email me. And a reminder again, there will not be a class meeting next week. So no class, face-to-face meeting on next Thursday. All right, and I look forward to seeing your Wednesday drafts and then the final. And around Sunday or Monday next week, you should have your grade and evaluation on the assignment 2, which I'm working through. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.